everyone. Welcome to the Rheticus Forum at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church here on the campus. This is our third year of doing the Rheticus Forum. It began 2 years ago with some seed money from a church in Mattoon that actually was closing its doors, an ELCA congregation. And under the leadership of Ken Truelove, they were trying to figure out how do they extend their ministry in some kind of a legacy. So they sold their building and they gave some money to food banks and those kind of things. But then they gave some money to St. Andrew's as a way of affirming this ministry to emerging adults of the church. And they attached two little requests with the gift to us. They said, first of all, do some updating of the gathering area so people feel welcome in a more modern way, which we did. And then they said, we would like to support a lecture or some kind of something that would support the integration of conversation around issues of faith and issues of science. Out of that, we put together a task force, and the task force started what we call the Rheticus Forum. Those of you who have been here before have heard that Rheticus is a contemporary of Copernicus and Martin Luther. He actually was hired by Melanchthon to be a math professor at Wittenberg College at the very same time that Martin Luther was doing whatever Martin Luther was doing. And in our imagination, we would imagine that Luther and Rheticus probably had some interesting conversations. Which is why we began Rheticus Forum as a way to dialogue with issues of faith and science, not in this polemic against, but how does one inform the other? This year we added the sense of culture. What are the questions that we are asked to engage in a new way as we wonder about faith and science and culture? So we begin this season of lectures. There'll be 2 this semester and another 2 next semester, with some conversation with Pastor Roger Davis. And we are honored to have you with us. And I think there are some people here that know you well. Just a handful. But anyway, we're pleased to have you with us. You did your Master's of Divinity at the Lutheran School Theological Seminary in Gettysburg. I'm not going to ask what year, but anyway. But anyway, has had a wonderful, rich history and being connected with many things in life, which I think feeds this experience of being pastor in a way that is deep and wide. We are pleased to have you with us, and we welcome you to this forum here at St.
Don't mind, I'm going to sit for this because 50 minutes is a long time to stand these days. I want to begin by thanking Pastor Lane for inviting me to be the first speaker in this year's Rheticus Forum series. When she first asked me, I thought to myself, why me? But I thought about it for a while, and then I realized, no, really, why me? Because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a theologian. My millennial generation children would assure you I am no expert in culture, classical or contemporary. I'm just a parish pastor with 30 years experience of sitting through church council meetings, going to hospital rooms, and grinding out weekly sermons. I have no advanced degrees. I have no books or articles published, nor blogs posted. I don't even have one Twitter follower. Not that I've ever tweeted, so indeed, why me? But then I remembered, I have not always been a pastor. Indeed, I have not always been a Christian. Many years ago, at age 18, I discovered that I had lost the faith that I had learned in Sunday school, and I left the church, intending never to come back. The conflict between, on the one hand, what science was teaching me about cosmology and evolution, and what my fundamentalist religious upbringing had taught me, had already created a certain cognitive dissonance long before my teenage years. How could I believe this anymore if all the empirical evidence were pointing to that? How could I think both kinds of thoughts? But I did, for a while. You can live with a lot of cognitive dissonance if you just ignore it. But along came the Vietnam War. Many of you don't remember that, but I do, because I was imminently eligible for the draft. And now the conflict between what my church, not all churches, but my conservative church taught me to regard as heroes. People like Joshua, Samson, Gideon, who slew their enemies, every man, woman, and child of them, and who I was coming to regard as heroes. Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, that Jesus guy, who seemed to resist their enemies non-violently. That conflict so increased my cognitive dissonance that the accumulated weight of it pushed me right out the church door. And it's been a long and winding road back that continues to this day. So while I am certainly no scholar about the relationship between science, culture, and religion, how I think about those relationships has become very important to me personally. So let's think about it. Now let me begin, as those of you who know my sermons know, I often begin by telling a story. Once upon a time, almost 40 years ago, my best friend John and I took a canoe out on a northern Wisconsin lake at about 2 o'clock in the morning. It is possible alcohol was involved, but that is not the point. The point is that as we reached the middle of the lake on a crystal clear dark night, miles from the nearest artificial light, it felt as though we were floating in a sea of stars. Above us in the canopy of night, and below us in the unruffled mirror of the lake. Stars all around us. And suddenly I found myself feeling afraid, disoriented. It felt like we were floating in the empty nothingness of deep space. Adrift in a vast, cold, uncaring universe, far from the warming light of my home sun and the reassuring feel of the earth beneath my feet. I felt totally alone. I think that's one of the main reasons why often, not always, but often, the first impulse of religion and culture has been to resist whatever new idea scientific thinking has brought into the public square. Remember, we used to have a firmament over our heads, a very comforting thing in which were embedded the stars that shone with the glory of God. And in the firmament there were fixed the moon, a concentric spheres in which the moon and the planets revolved to celestial music that was so sweet. Then along comes science. And what are we told we have over our heads now? A thin, invisible layer of air, which is the only thing that protects us from the nearly infinite expanse of unimaginably frigid, hostile space in which we would explode or asphyxiate in seconds. Thank you, science. Once, we thought the Earth was the center of the universe, the sole object of God's benevolent attention. Now we're told there is no center. And the Earth is just one tiny little satellite of an ordinary star moving through the outskirts of an unremarkable galaxy, which is only part of a pedestrian cluster of galaxies, one of the smallest in a supercluster of galaxies, lost in a vast expanse of superclusters astronomers call the Great Wall, which may or may not be one of the largest structures in the universe, compared to which the Earth is less than a tiny, infinitesimal. Thanks again, science. Once we thought humanity was the whole point of history, our creation and our redemption, its bookends. Now we're told that humans are just the tail end of a 13.75 billion year parade, a Johnny-come-lately species born in the last second of the last minute of the last hour of the great cosmic day. Here we are. No wonder religion, to its great shame, has too often treated science with hostility, on occasion burning scientists at the stake, banning scientific in books, and even today lobbying legislators or petitioning courts to make sure our version of cosmology, well, their version of cosmology, is taught in science class. No wonder our culture is more inclined to believe in, or at least watch television shows about flying saucers or Bigfoot, than it is to believe in evolution or the possibility that human beings could ruin the environment. For many, scientific thinking is too scary. Its ideas are too big or too complicated, and they make us feel too small or too simple. Which is actually scientific thinking's greatest gift to religion and to culture: perspective. One of my favorite passages in the Hebrew Bible is in the book of Job. If you've read the book of Job, you may recall Job had one really bad day. In one day, all of his kids die, all of his flocks and herds are stolen or destroyed, his body is covered in oil, and his so-called friends, worst friends ever, insist that it's all his fault. You must have done something, Job, for God to be this mad at you. They keep badgering him about how evil he must have been, until finally Job gets angry. Not just at his friends, but at God. He demands that God come down right now and answer for what he has done to Job. And God does. Be careful what you wish for. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man," that means put on your big boy pants. "I will question you, and you shall declare to me, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy?" In other words, who are you, little man, to question me? And Job responds, "I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me. I have heard of you by the hearing of my ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes." That's not a very popular way to think about our relationship with God these days. Hollywood would rather have us think of God as kind of our bestest buddy. You know, Morgan Freeman, affable, genial, twinkle in his eye, a guy who looks like us, thinks like us, talks like us, agrees with us as we pick and choose which scriptures we think other people ought to follow. And we all pick and choose, at least those of us who have scriptures. No matter how sophisticated we may think we are down deep, we still think of God as kind of like me. Big me, but still me. But scientific thinking shows us, it doesn't mean to, but it does, that God cannot be anything like me. Because scientific thinking, with all the marvelous instruments at its disposal, has been unable to find any physical trace of God anywhere in the universe, at any time, on any scale. That means God cannot look like me because I occupy space. God doesn't. God can't think like me because I think neurologically. God doesn't have neurons or vocal cords or biology of any kind. Indeed, according to scientific thinking, the God religion puts its trust in, who, dare I say it, does not and cannot exist. Which is actually good news for religion, but let me explain that before I get Hillary. Things exist. Things come into existence and go back out of existence. God does not. Things, scientific thinking, can detect and measure. God, it cannot, because God is not a thing. In fact, God is unlike anything we can imagine, despite the best efforts of theologians. And in part, we have scientific thinking to thank for that insight. Religious thinking too, but sometimes we religious thinkers forget. In a time when too often we tend to make God in our image, the grandeur of the universe, the intricacy of the biological systems which science has discovered, helps actually put us back in right relationship with God. On that Wisconsin lake 40 years ago, my existential terror was a realization of the awesome difference between my tiny, finite, insignificant self and the majesty of a God who created all that. I didn't know that then. I was still too full of my brilliantly thought out denial of God's being, but I understand it now, a little. And now I feel not only terrified and awed, but I also feel a surprised joy that the God who created all that, who is responsible for all this, who may or may not have made dozens, hundreds, millions, billions of other species of self-aware beings across the ocean of Nine, still cares about the little me. And while that joy may be due to religious rather than scientific thinking, I thank scientific thinking for magnifying my awe and my wonder a billionfold. But perspective is not the only gift scientific thinking has bequeathed to religion and culture. One of my favorite passages in the Christian scriptures comes from the Gospel of John. In the passage it says, as he, Jesus, walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Like Job's friends, Jesus' friends are operating under the theory that bad things only happen to bad people. Therefore, this man must have done something bad to be blind, but he was born blind before he could do anything bad. So it must have been his parents who were bad, but if bad things only happen to bad people, then why didn't God blind them and not him? Ow! Cognitive dissonance. What their religious upbringing had taught them and the facts and evidence are in conflict. How will Jesus resolve it? Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Now, I don't know, but I don't think God means God struck a baby blind. So what, 20, 30, 40 years later, Jesus come along and give him sight? That's despicable. No, I think this is Jesus' way of saying, I don't know. Bad things happen. As he says elsewhere in the Gospels, rain falls on the just and the unjust alike. We can't know why. What we can do is respond to this bad thing compassionately. And that's what Jesus does. I don't know. That is and should be one of the greatest gifts of religious thinking. I don't know what God looks like or sounds like. If God looks or sounds like anything at all. I don't know if God is Trinitarian or Unitarian or Multitarian or Notarian. I'm pretty sure God's not Rotarian, no offense to him. Rotarian. I don't know why bad things happen to good people or anybody. I don't know what God's ultimate solution to the problem of humanity, our problems, will be, or when or how it may happen. I don't know whose scriptures are correct, if any are. At its heart, religion is experiential, not propositional. It senses, it perceives, it develops ritual and holy stories that help others sense and perceive things that cannot be put in words. Religious language is fundamentally poetic. Religious thinking can't know the ultimate answers to its questions, but it can believe in, it can trust in, it can experience dimly someone who does know. But too often, religionists have lost sight of the fact that we don't know. Scientists do too, but they seem to be a little bit more self-correcting, maybe not. All I know is that people have been stoned to death, hacked to death, drowned, burned at the stake, blown up with bombs, you name it. In the defense of religious propositions no one knows are true. So yes, Sometimes religious thinking needs a little help from its friend. Scientific thinking begins with "I don't know." That's what drives it. Not knowing what the basic building block of genetic inheritance was or how it was structured. Not knowing why the planet Mercury refused to adhere to Newton's law of gravity. Not knowing the mass of the Higgs boson whose corresponding field imparts mass to the whole universe, or something like that. Not knowing how or if quantum theories which explain the behavior of very small things and the theories of relativity which explain the behaviors of very large things fit together. There are many, many things scientific thinking doesn't know more than it does. And scientific thinking knows that it doesn't know, just as Jesus knew that we don't know. Scientific thinking, though, has a different response. Scientific thinking hypothesizes. I love that word. There's another word for that. It guesses. Educated guesses, but still guesses, almost all of which are wrong. I feel so sorry for scientists sometimes. Some are downright absurd, but all of which make predictions which can be tested. And if one hypothesis makes predictions which are verified, it may become a theory, expanding the field of what we do know, but of course exposing much more that we don't. Scientific thinking may learn a great deal, but it knows that what it knows is a far cry from knowing everything. This admission of uncertainty, which is the bedrock of scientific thinking, or ought to be, benefits both religion and culture, although sometimes neither are particularly grateful. Which brings us to culture and its gifts to science and religion. What is culture? Culture is not just those refined things human beings do, which we educated sophisticates value. Things like opera, for example, as opposed to, hot dog eating contests, or films like Casablanca, as opposed to the TV show Here Comes Honey Boo Boo. No, culture is everything we do, unfortunately, including science and religion. So where do I even begin to talk about culture's contributions to both? 2.5 million years ago, long before we were Homo sapiens, maybe before we were Homo anything, just Australopiths, paleontological evidence shows that creatures somewhat like us, trending toward us, were conducting experiments with rocks. Long before we could talk, much less have words for what we were doing, we tested hypotheses. What will happen if I bang this rock with this rock in this way? Ha! Something sharp to butcher an antelope with. That's great. Many creatures experiment, but it is culture which allowed us to pass the results of our experiments down from generation to generation for hundreds of thousands of years. It was culture that transformed isolated individual experiments eventually into science. It's a lot harder to pinpoint when culture first produced religious thinking, because religion doesn't leave stone artifacts behind. Well, it does, but how can we tell if the feelings or the thoughts behind those artifacts are religious? I mean, is it possible, for example, that those flint knappers from 2.5 million years ago were regarded as shamans? Maybe if Australopiths or Homo erectus had shamans, we don't know. We do know we found human remains from 100,000 years ago, which appear to have been deliberately buried, marked with red ochre, and found with implements people used in their daily life. Were those implements buried with them with the expectation that they could use them in some afterlife? We don't know. We do know we have found caves hundreds of feet underground, filled with incredible paintings of reindeer and bulls and horses in human hands and abstract symbols which appear to have had spiritual significance almost 30,000 years ago. But we don't know. But it certainly seems that well before we could call it religion, people wondered about life and death and the nature of the world around them, and sought to communicate through culturally derived arts and maybe even rituals with beings seen and unseen. In other words, culture is the mother of both science and religion and has nurtured them both throughout the ages. So much so that I couldn't begin to cover all their contributions in 1,000 Rheticus Forum presentations. Don't worry, I won't try. I'll just comment briefly on 3. When I was a freshman in college, my first and only college math professor was convinced I had a bright future in the subject. And she tried very hard to persuade me to make math my major. I never told her I would rather have majored in leprosy. It's not that I didn't like math, it's just that after a certain level, pretty fundamentalist level, I found it tedious. History, on the other hand, seemed a lot of fun, so I majored in that. You may have detected history's influence in this presentation. But later in life, as I developed more of an interest in science, I discovered to my horror that science is not just about telling cool stories about space or dinosaurs or birds. In fact, at its basic level, science doesn't use what I consider language at all. When scientists want to communicate the evidence of their theories or the concreteness of their evidence, they use horrible things like calculus, statistics, and other forms of math I can't even bring myself to name. Oh, sure, my hero Einstein used thought experiments to originate his theories of special and general relativity, but of course then he had to go and back them up with math. When Sir Arthur Eddington, well, it wasn't Sir Arthur then, traveled to the remote island of Principe in 1919 to observe a solar eclipse, he didn't just go out there to observe a gorgeous stellar corona. Oh no, he was testing Einstein's math. And sure enough, starlight was bent by the mass of the sun to the exact extent that Einstein predicted. Or so I've read. I can't do the math. When on March 14th of this year, physicists at the Large Hadron Collider confirmed they found the particle, which may be evidence of the Higgs field, which apparently provides all the mass that keeps us on this floor, they used statistics to demonstrate that there was only 1/1,000,000th of a chance that they were wrong. I'll take your word for it. Math is the language of science. But science didn't create math. Not originally. Culture created math. At some point in our past, it became important to know how many goats we had, or baskets of wheat, or units of land. So, we invented math. Religion doesn't use math much. In fact, some church treasurers will tell you that pastors are actually bad at math, which is a scurrilous charge. We are just optimistic at math. Religion uses other languages, story, poetry, and above all, at least as far as I'm concerned, music. My mother, Doris, has resided at the Champaign-Urbana Regional Rehab Center for nearly 6 years now. Doris has a very rich mental life these days, most of which correspond to things that are actually happening in the real world, but some of which happen only in her head. Some of Mom's imaginations, delusions, hallucinations are really kind of funny. Some, unfortunately, are very frightening to her, and some give her great joy. Every once in a while, my mother hears a choir in her head. An excellent gospel choir, she tells me, which sings songs which apparently she knows by heart. They should, I mean, after all, it's her head. Sometimes she joins in, harmonizing in a still passable alto, and if I'm there, if I can pick up the key, I'll sing right along with her. I'll sing lead because I know those hymns too. The CNA's kind of wonder about me. I grew up with those hymns, though. I haven't sung them in decades, but one doesn't forget the hymns of one's childhood. Music is somehow able to touch our hearts and souls, our memories in ways no other form of human expression can. Music draws people into community. I don't know when it began or where or how. I suspect there was music long before there was math. And people hummed or chanted or drummed long before they were people. But thank you, culture, for creating the language of religion's heart. But there is a new gift that culture is only beginning to give to science and religion and itself. And no, I'm not talking about